So this is the last talk, so I would kind of do an arc. So see kind of where this all fits, all the things that we discussed and learned during the school, how it kind of fits into the grand scheme of things. And so what we see is that the big data in science is really here. So the data is doubling every year. It's growing exponentially in all sciences. And the sciences are becoming data-driven, as we see in our own field in astronomy. And the other challenge related to this is that the data, these increasingly large data sets that we are dealing with, are also increasingly becoming public. And so it is not that we just have to store more data on our disk drives, but we have to figure out ways how can we make these large data sets accessible and put it out for everyone to use. And we also see, lots of people here are running simulations where we take first physical principles and out of those principles we create a complex simulation of reality. And now this was for a long time only done in the physical sciences, in particular in the hydrodynamics and finite element methods and so on. And now people are doing the same thing in biology, or even simulating the circulation of the blood in the arteries, for example, and creating very complex models of the heart, for example. So, and they are starting to deploy the same methods and same techniques and technologies as we have been in the physical sciences for the last 20 years. And much of the conversion is happening through the big data. At the same time, it's tempting to think about that the big data is all about the very large data sets. So that some surveys, so LSA is going to generate 100 petabytes, and so the SK is going to generate exabytes. But when we look at the world of data out there, it has a power law distribution. So for every very large data set, there are 10 times as many data sets, which are 10 times smaller individually. And so the integral, when we look at all the different octaves of this distribution, then basically we see that there's the same amount of data in every logarithmic interval. So there is the so-called long tail problem. So there are also an enormous number of small data sets. Just think about all your little data sets that you already collected over your careers. And a lot of them are in little files, but then you actually want to do operations with those data against the big data sets and do all sorts of cross matches, cross correlations, and so on. And all in all, what we see today is there is a new scientific revolution taking place. So for thousands of years, science has been very empirical. We just collected data and described nature. So Leonardo was drawing the turbulent fluid and so on, and we captured then what nature was doing, and the Chinese created the first star maps, star charts, and so on. Then starting with Kepler, then a lot of this empirical data was translated into analytical equations that we were able to solve analytically. At some point, we realized that some of the equations, like the Navier-Stokes equation, is simple to write down, but it's complex to solve. And Fermi and Ulam were the first who employed computers to solve these equations during the Manhattan Project. So we saw that empirical phase of science, then we saw an analytical phase of science, then we saw a computational phase of science. And during this computational era, computational astrophysics, computational cosmology, computational biology, and so on, so computational X, and where X is your own discipline. And what we see today, that there is yet another discipline emerging, or another way of doing science is emerging, where we use a lot of data to derive our primary hypothesis and use the data to drive our science entirely, which is a combination of statistics, and you saw during the school, basically, how it all fits together. So there were talks sometimes by the same lecturer. One talk was on statistics, the other was on computation, the other one was on simulations. So this all is coming together, and this is a new way of doing science. and rejoice, because it's not very often that there is a scientific revolution taking place, and it's happening right now. And you are actually at the prime of your careers. So what is the story today? How are we analyzing scientific data? Again, so we are crossing over now with this doubling of data. So projects are starting to cross over the petabyte scale. So actually CERN is now at around 22 petabytes in the so-called tier 0 data today. The 10 genomes have been observed already at BGI, the Beijing Genomics Institute, and that is about 5 petabytes. They are already building an archive which is 50 petabytes. So you can see that now, a few years ago, it was terabyte was the name of the game. Today, it is petabytes. At the same time, as there are these new experimental facilities springing up, data will be at the same location and at a single location, because by the time we would move the data to that location, there is already a new project starting up which is using new instruments, and it is generating even more data. So they're constantly, things are leapfrogging each other. And this is the dynamics, how the exponential growth is happening. So every new project has a much more capable instrument, which is able to generate data at a much higher rate. At the same time, the computing architectures are increasingly CPU heavy and IO poor. And this is very technology driven. So we saw curse of Moore's law. And so basically the way Moore's law manifests itself today is not through increasing the clock rate of the CPUs, but putting more and more cores on the same chip. And we have even seen how GPUs now have hundreds of cores on the same chip, but Intel already has this prototype of the next generation multi-core processor where they have essentially Xeon cores, I think 40-some Xeon cores on a single chip. And it will get higher and higher density. At the same time, these technologies have hardly changed over the last 10 or 15 years. So maybe the disk platters had become a little higher density. So in the 3.5-inch disk drives, the disk platters today, each platter holds about 1 terabyte. And the density of the magnetic domains on those disks is increasing slightly. But the revolution speed of the disk has not changed dramatically. So, and the run-of-the-mill drives typically rotate at 7,200 RPM. And we already had 7,200 RPM drive 15 years ago. So this limits the access time. And of course, solid-state disks are emerging, and they form the basis of Gordon and many other systems. It is not clear whether they are here to stay for the long run, or there is something like memory stores are going to replace them on a 5 to 10 year time scale. But right now, certainly solid-state disk prices are falling, and they offer some unique benefits, but at a much higher than regular hard disk. So when it's about quantity of data, there's still no replacement for the regular hard disk today. Okay. Typically, we see that scientists are very quick to use new features and new hardware, new commodity hardware as it emerges. So scientists, in particular physicists and astronomers, have been among the first to use, for example, GPUs. Then we typically, in the large simulations, use very structured data. So we use multidimensional arrays. And for a long time, this was not really used in the industry or in commerce. They were mostly using unstructured data. And so the whole MapReduce framework of Google was developed to handle massive amounts of unstructured data and just scraping through this in an organized fashion. Okay. Today, when we look how data analysis is done, first of all, it is not done on supercomputers, because supercomputers are typically, with the exception of Gordon, are really very, very CPU heavy, and there is very little focus on the IO infrastructure or IO architecture. So when it comes to data, people are pragmatic and they say, I just buy my own bare bones there, use a startup fund, and then essentially do the data analysis there. And also those clusters don't really have a particularly good I/O either. But at least it's under the control of the people and of the groups who are doing the analysis. Result. So more and more, every faculty member in natural sciences at this point wants their own cluster. They arrive to a new faculty job, then they use a good part of their startup to buy a cluster, then they want to put it into a lab. The lab doesn't have enough power, that they plug it in anyway. Sooner or later, the former of the is going to burn down. It did at Hopkins. So for about 3 to 4 months, we were on generator power, about 1 megawatt of generators. So a couple of big trucks were pulled in from Virginia, and cables like my arm, and they were hot. So it was unbelievable. And the people under whose windows the generators were not able to do any work, so they had to move to another side of the building. So this is so how far can this go on? And it is obvious that also, big data will soon mean that that the data is going to come in from our sensors at such a rate that we cannot even store the data stream. We have to process it on the fly. In many ways, this is already happening at CERN, where the detectors are generating much more data, and they use a hardware filter to trigger only on those events which may be relevant for the physics. So they only keep the 22 petabytes is only 1 out of 10 million events. So the data rate is already pruned by a factor of 10 million before they hit the 22 petabytes. And soon with SKA and so on, there will be also so much data coming off the radio telescopes and the silicon that there's just no chance to actually capture the raw data streams. All that we can hope for is that we do some processing and we capture the process product. So, for example, the cross correlations. So all in all, this is not scalable and not maintainable. And the trouble is that the growth is at such a rate that we cannot just keep up by buying more hardware. So in particular, this is true for DNA sequencing, where people were caught asleep, essentially. So they really thought that they can just throw hardware at it. And now it is becoming blatantly obvious that that's not the case. So, and you cannot run what worked for 10 gigabytes of data will not work for 10 petabytes. So running Perl scripts, etc., and storing all the information in a long file name. Once you have 100 million files, then essentially you will not find, and the file systems are going to crash. So why is astronomy interesting in this world? Because it is strange how quickly astronomers have overall adopted. And it is very interesting when you think about it. So most sciences are kind of starting out in a lab or either observing kind of the environment, but you can do experiments. So you have a desktop experiment, you measure something, then you go in and change the parameters in your experiment. You change the pressure, you change the temperature, and then redo the experiment and look for trends and patterns and whether something changes. What can we do in astronomy? We cannot go out there and essentially, for example, change the position of some stars or galaxies. All that we can do is observe the universe as is. We cannot even change our point of reference. So we have to observe the universe from the same point. And so astronomers learned somehow very early on at the deep subconscious level that only thing we can do is to take observational data and derive our hypothesis from there. So when we discovered supernovae, it was not that we had a hypothesis that, okay, these must be, neutron stars should be collapsing and therefore we should look for these pings on the sky. It was the other way around. We saw something go ping, and then eventually 100 years later, we figured out what they are through a series of experiments. So this is Jim Gray. So So Bill Gates was asking him, why are you spending all your time on astronomy data? And Jim's response was that because the data is worthless. His data is worthless, or the astronomer's data is worthless, and he loves doing this. And when you think about this, this is so true. So basically, health data and medical data is protected by HIPAA, by privacy rights. So you cannot do experiment with it. You cannot share the data and try out different algorithms. Okay. Same time, you don't need lawyers. It's not a commercial data. Nobody is going to make $1 billion. So in a sense, astronomy is a $0 billion science. Well, we are spending this is giving us $1 billion for our data. But so this is, in many ways, this is the strength of using astronomy data for all these experiments. We can play with statistical algorithms and ideas without really restrictions. And the sociology of astronomy has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. So before that, astronomers were typically very reluctant to share data with each other. But with both with the Hubble Deep Field and then with the Sloan, this has completely changed. So now I think astronomers are really quite happy to have the data used by somebody else. So. But what we also have to realize is that simulations are becoming an instrument in its own right. So the larger simulations approach petabytes, and it goes now across kind of all the disciplines of science. And at the same time, there is this challenge that the biggest supercomputers are becoming increasingly more and more expensive. So they are now in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And when you have to run a code that runs efficiently on 300,000 cores or millions of cores soon, then there are only very few people in the world who have both the code and the skills to do this efficiently. So in a sense, this pyramid is that in this computational pyramid is getting taller and taller, and at the top there are only always a very small number of people. Yet the integral, the money that we have to spend on this is becoming more and more for society. So in order to justify the use of these high-end computers, really the results coming off of those computations need to be shared more and more broadly. And again, this is the reason why we have this school here. So that how can we take, for example, some of the best simulations, turn them into reference data sets, like the Millennium was, and compare them to the largest surveys, and then enable to people also to bring little data sets and basically cross-match, cross-identify, cross-correlate, so to extract maximum information out of all this data. And so we need to create a widely public access to the best and latest simulations and turn them into interactive numerical laboratories. And I think this was actually the first school of this kind. So this is really just starting, and you are it. And this, of course, creates a whole bunch of new challenges. So the simplest things that how to move the data to where the analysis, where the numerical laboratory is going to be. It's okay, it's trivial if it's a gigabyte. It's doable when it's a few terabytes. And it's pretty tough when it gets to a few petabytes. So even the simplest things are hard. Then how do you look at the data, and how do you interact with the data? What is the metaphor that you use? How do you do the rendering? Again, so we saw the very nice visualizations like with the video wall. But basically, if you have a petabyte, so how do we visualize data today? That we take the data set, copy it to the workstations that have the GPUs and do the rendering. Okay, if it's a petabyte, you have to move a petabyte of data to those workstations. First of all, they don't have a petabyte of storage. Okay, and generally, if the data happens to be on the other side of the continent, so this is forget it. So you can't even think about it. At the same time, then on the smartphones, pretty much every smart device and an iPad will have a high enough bandwidth to receive a video in high definition pretty soon in 3D. Okay, so what if we did actually all the visualization on server side, and essentially send a video stream to the users. And we just developed the tools how to drive the visualizations basically remotely. And this is also emerging. How do we interface? What is the right metaphor to interact with lots of data? Today we download the files. And we heard Matt talk about YT, which is a really nice way where you don't have to deal with the raw files and the numerical data. It deals with basically physical quantities, and you can interactively slice and dice the data as you wish and visualize it. So these are the new metaphors that we are in the process of inventing. So this is kind of how it fits together. And then there's the question, how do we analyze it? When the data is growing, the number of data points in our sample is doubling every year. Andy was talking about that the matrix inversions or diagonalizations are typically n-cubed operations. Imagine that your n is doubling every year. Your compute power is also doubling every year, but the matrices that you have to diagonalize go with n-cubed. Your computational problem is becoming 4 times worse every year. We have to do something else, because this is just not doable any longer. So this boils down to invent new algorithms, new statistical algorithms, and much of the traditional statistics that astronomers used to learn is about the statistical noise, reducing statistical noise. Why? Because our data sets were small. So 50 years ago, in Hubble's time, there were a couple of hundred galaxies with distances, with redshifts. Today, we have millions. So today, in today's data sets, the statistical error is the least of our worry, because we have plenty of data points. It is the systematic errors that we cannot, known and unknown systematics. And the systematic errors could be instrumental, but I would also call something called the cosmic variance an instrumental or a systematic error or uncertainty, that we cannot change the position from which we look at the universe. So we cannot basically sample the universe in many different locations. We are in one particular place, and we have to live with it. And this means that there are certain things that, given a certain volume, we only have a single realization of the universe that we look at. How can we help? Do lots and lots of simulations. So this is, for example, why doing many simulations is so important. Not just to do one big simulation, but we have to do them hundreds of simulations to be able to understand that what is the cosmic variance in this. So this all kind of ties into this picture. And so I'd like to show a few samples how we are exploring also sort of new ways to along each of these axes. So one project we have been working on at Hopkins is on turbulence. And we call it immersive because this is a large 30 terabyte simulation, 1,000 cube simulation of isotropic turbulence with a medium Reynolds number, about 470. But we stored also 1,000 time steps, 1,000 snapshots separated by 10 time steps each. And the idea was this is a Fourier space simulation, so it doesn't have particles. It's on a regular grid, source for the spectral energy transfer. But we wanted to do statistics on this. And the idea was that we basically play like movie Twister. So there are all these vortex tubes in the simulation, which are mini tornadoes. And we would like to study the statistical properties, how do the tornadoes form, and how do they break up. And how do the guys study tornadoes in Twister? They go drive there close to the tornado and shoot sensors into the tornado. And then they whirl around, and through a radio, they send out basically constantly a stream of information about the orbits. And why can't we do this with a simulation? So what it would take is a laptop and a web service front end. So you take 1,000 particles or 10,000 particles, and you shoot them into the simulation wherever you want. You determine the position. And then they keep reporting back basically the fluid velocity or the dissipation rate or the pressure. And you can imagine this doing in cosmology as well. So you can get the temperature and all the different physical quantities. In many ways, this is what YT is trying to do already. But this means that with the particles, we can shoot them in also in an unstructured grid, also along the word line, so all the particles could be at different time steps as well. All that we have to do then is to, around every point, we have to take an epsilon neighborhood, so say an 8 cube neighborhood, then perform a Lagrangian interpolation of the fluid velocity, and then also perform a temporal interpolation between the time steps, and we have a very accurate representation of the velocity field. And this works like a charm. So here is, for example, a code sample calling a SOAP web service out of Fortran, courtesy of Tomaj. So I think this may have been the first case when Fortran was used to call a SOAP web service. So he wrote, I think, a C++ harness, which then he wrote a Fortran calling interface for the C++. Anyway, but the nice thing is one can, for example, put down particles which are along this square bracket, and then you actually integrate, move them back in time. You cannot do this in a direct numerical integration. So you can see that what was the past of those particles, and so you can put them down in a ring which surrounds a vortex tube, for example, and then you can see where did these particles come from. And this is basically what you do, is that you simply call a get velocity function. So you have a whole bunch of data points. There's the array points. And basically, you specify what is the interpolation scheme, and then what is the time, and then essentially your authentication string or authentication key, and you basically get back the new position of the points, or sorry, the velocity of the points, and then you can basically do the advanced, you can move the particles on your laptop if you wish. And for example, one of my colleagues has added then a stochastic term to the equation of motion, so a stochastic perturbation. And using this, he was able to prove an old theorem, or numerically prove an old theorem that was with us since the 1930s related to turbulence, and nobody was able to show actually that scaling relation is satisfied. And using the database, he was able to prove it. Here are just some pictures. So this is basically calling the database points from MATLAB, and then basically throwing down particles just along the 2D surface. But again, we didn't have to download files, and we interact directly with physical quantities here. So this is a 2D cut. This is computing, downloading points and computing the velocity gradient tensor and computing the invariance. And one of those is the magnitude of the vorticity vector. So the curl. And this is just displaying it in 3D by basically randomly sampling the cube. So this is the typical daily usage of the database for turbulence. And on a typical day, we roughly deliver about 100 million points to the world. So it's surprisingly well used, and a bunch of PhysRev letters, papers, and others have been published. And it has been up now for 4 years. So I think, yeah, 4 years, and we delivered more than 100 billion points to the community. But of course, cosmology, so we are all astrophysicists. So in cosmology, again, the challenge is that, in Millennium had about roughly 10 billion particles, and today we can do simulations with 1 trillion particles. So the data sets are really much, much bigger. And for example, in Millennium XXL, the dark matter, they were only able to save 4 snapshots of the dark matter particles because the files are so large. And it would have been much nicer to have actually a much more detailed time history of the dark matter particles. So they could only store the Halo catalogs. And this is a picture that Gerard has shown already. And this is something that Tomaj has shown. But the trick is to essentially use a very efficient indexing structure. Why is this important? Because of the way the hard drives work. So when we do the computations, first of all, already, for example, in Gadget, the data is organized in a similar fashion, so spatially coherent fashion, so that all the points which are close to one another in 3D space, they are also stored close to one another in memory. Why is this good? Because even in the memory, for the speed of access, locality is the key. So because of the cache hierarchy. So if you basically read one number from somewhere in memory, then you get its whole neighborhood in the memory for free. because it propagates all the way through the cache hierarchy. So you don't have to issue another read. If, of course, if the simulation is, say, 1,000 cubed, imagine that it is stored in the XYZ order, then if I need basically a byte from here, if I need an 8 by 8 neighborhood, then I have to read basically 8 numbers here, then I have to jump basically 1,000 elements and then read another. So the strides are very, very short here. And this means that I would have to do actually 64 separate reads. So I have to read for every column of the data. If this was stored along a space filling curve, this would all come in pretty much with a single read operation. Okay. Anyway, so this is a key, and when the data is residing on the hard disk, it's even more important to actually store the data in such a way, because the cost of a random access is even more excessive. It's 4 milliseconds or 5 milliseconds per read, whereas we can read the data off a disk array at a gigabyte a second. So this is a project that after 4 tries, we actually did get NSF funding to build a database for this. So this is done in collaboration with Piero Mado and Michael Cullen and Connie Rakoshe. And the idea is to take a very large simulation, so the Silver River simulation, which will generate about 2.6 petabytes of output in Oak Ridge at the Jaguar system. And the first 150 terabytes have been run so far. And the idea is that after, this is of course outputting everything with double precision, and one can do all sorts of compression tricks. So we think that the database, once we store it in the database, it will be a little below a petabyte. But here, this is a Milky Way simulation to study how dwarf galaxies interact with the Milky Way and how they get absorbed. So this shows actually a picture taken by an amateur. The guy has an observatory in New Mexico, a remotely operated observatory in New Mexico. And this is a picture, a 24-hour effective exposure of an edge-on galaxy. And you can see this very faint trail. And this is a dwarf galaxy that has collided with the plane of this galaxy. Then the orbits of the stars in the dwarf galaxy got perturbed, and the trail of stars has been left behind. Then it came around and crossed over again. And this is now where the dwarf galaxy is right now. So it was a very low surface brightness picture. And these are the things that people started to see in the Sloan. People looked at streams of stars in the Milky Way, where the age of the stellar population in a local neighborhood did not fit the rest of the stars in that neighborhood. And the only reasonable explanation was that this came from this tidal disruption of a dwarf galaxy, and this formed these cold streams. And there were several found. At this point, I think we are at 15 streams that have been found in the Sloan. And it would be nice, so the way people try to reproduce these is to take a scalar potential that roughly corresponded to the gravitational potential of a Milky Way galaxy, and then they were throwing in dwarf galaxies containing 10,000 particles or so, and see how they got disrupted in time. But of course, the tidal disruption is very much affected by substructure. So instead of a smooth potential, if we put in a realistic fluctuations in the potential and the time variable components, then it will be quite a bit more efficient. So for example, this is another way to insert test particles, where the test particle is not just a sensor that measures temperature or something, but essentially consisting of a set of particles which, of course, have no effect on the pre-computed time-dependent gravitational potential of the simulation, but they would still feel the fluctuations as they get disrupted and form the tail. So people could pick their own dwarf galaxy mass and the profile and then impact parameters and shoot it into the Milky Way and see how it gets disrupted and see whether it is similar to the ones observed in Sloan, for example. But do it in real time, and this would be a way to interact remotely with a petabyte in real time. And then if you like the impact parameters and the experiments, then you could generate actually movies. So that's the idea. And then we are getting to visualization. So again, so it needs to be done where the data is, because it's much easier to send a video stream than a data stream. And so the visualizations are becoming I/O limited. In the GPU cards, they are becoming so fast that the challenge is at this point, besides the coding, so that you have to code in CUDA or OpenGL, the trick is how do we get the data in fast enough into the GPU cards so that we can keep the processors busy and they are not idle. And today, so some of the ideas are to create, for example, specialized pre-computed data structures, create a hierarchy of the data, that the data is stored in octrees, for example, and prefetch the previous time steps from the hard disks to SSDs. So they are just in time. So when we actually have to run the visualization, they are already coming up the SSDs. But of course, we will never have enough SSDs to store a petabyte of simulation there. So we always have to kind of keep the data moving just in time. At the same time, it is also possible to build individual servers with extreme data rates that can run multiple gigabytes per server. I will show a few slides about this. And we have built a prototype now for this visualization, in situ visualization for the Turbulence, where we combine the database engine with several GPU cards in the same system. So we don't have to use the network to transfer data into a GPU card, but we actually can send the data stream directly on the PCI bus of the hardware. And even that is not fast enough. So we are kind of at a point. So I'd like to show a few of these pictures. So these are streamlines, again, from the Turbulence simulation as the data was streaming into the GPU. Okay. So these are, again, attractors of a whole bunch of particles launched into the flow field. And then this was, and we were watching how these were aggregating. This is actually a movie, which is, oops, sorry. So these are 24 million particles that are moving in the time-dependent field of the Turbulence simulation. And so here again, what is interesting that, this is done essentially almost in real time. This was a Tyan workstation motherboard, which had that had the fastest I/O bandwidth that we could find, and we packed it full of solid-state disks, and we stored about 100 time steps, and this was a 580 GTX 580 card in it. So what was this was one workstation, one card, and about 7 solid-state disks. But the machine had, I think, what was it, 5 X16 slots. So it was really kind of this was about the fastest motherboard about 1.5 years ago. And yeah, and it was. But what was also interesting for the visualization, you need the data again stored in XYZ order. In the full cubed. Okay, so first of all, the GPU memory was not large enough to store the whole simulation box. So what we had is that we were able to dynamically download a subset. And I think the biggest we were able to do at that point was 256 cube because of the memory limitations of the GPU. But then the data was stored in small cubes, 8 cube cells in the solid-state disks, and along a Morton curve, so Z index. And so instead of trying to reorganize outside using a database query, we actually just issued a query, fetch me all the blobs in arbitrary order which are inside this block, then got it into the database, and the data header gave the Morton index of the data. Then we run inside the GPU an inverse lookup function, which told us what is the XYZ corner where the data should fit. And then we use the internal copy speed of the GPU to copy it in place, because that's 200 gigabytes a second. So once it was inside the GPU, it was essentially free to do anything with the data. So the nice thing is that we basically store it in the disks, in a format which is more convenient for most of the tasks that we want to do and for a localized access. Because also if we want to extract a subregion, it is still best to use the space filling curve. And then after we kind of rearrange the data whichever way we want. And Kai was also able to compute, for example, the velocity gradient on the fly as the velocity data was loaded in, and then compute the invariants. That's actually the next simulation. This is showing the vorticity field. So this is computing on the data as it comes in the velocity gradient tensor, and then computing the magnitude of the vorticity vector. Okay, and you can, it's quite nice, I think. So it makes a nice picture. And this was the rendering done for VALE Actia by Michael Cullen. VALE Actia is something like 400 million particles, so it's similar to Aquarius. And this took, I think, several weeks to render basically a series of these images. And so altogether, the VALE Actia data is about 27 to 30 terabytes or so. And then this is building a Deloney Tessellation on a gadget simulation. This was done by Miguel Aragon Calvo, and basically coloring the different Deloney cells according to the local density. And again, this is, you can play with this interactively in 3D. So this shows, by the way, Miguel did something really neat. So he took an MP3 player in Java. And in an MP3 player, you have, I think, 128 frequency bands. And in this MP3 player, you could access the amplitude of each of the bands. He set up 128 contour levels in this visualization according to the density. And then he started to play the music, and he assigned the alpha level, the transparency of every one of those contour levels, to one of the frequency, amplitude of one of the frequency band. So as the music was playing, the whole thing was pausing. What is remarkable about it, that somehow after about 30 seconds, the brain started to really reconstruct the whole 3D information. You started to see all the contour services kind of in one go, simultaneously. Because it was a rhythmic music, so you could see the same patterns were recurring, but at the same time, no two bars of the music were quite the same, so it was still constant. So it was a randomized visualization, basically. It's very neat. And it has a magical effect on the brain. Oh, he put it up somewhere, so it's a, yeah, I should have done links, yeah. Anyway, and then this is something that my son Tomaj did when he was an undergrad at Caltech. So he did, he wrote a paper with Volker and Gerard. The challenge was to take the Aquarius simulations, which is 150 million particles, 128 time steps, about 20 billion total points in all the simulations and 1.4 terabytes. How can you visualize this interactively? So not to create a movie that you pre-compute and then essentially replay it, but create something that you can dynamically change the perspective, how you view, but the particles are actually still moving. And this was on a single GeForce 9800, which is, today's standards, is a pretty slow card. But so what he did is to pre-compute, first of all, he pre-computed an octree. So octree is that you take the cubical volume and subdivide it into, so you half each of the axes. This gives you 8 children. And then at each of the level, then you subsample. So you actually go on and on and on until you reach quite small cells. Then you start merging the cells. So when you merge 8 children cells, then you, of course, have roughly 8 times as many particles. So what he did then is he subsampled this 8 times as many particles by a factor of 8. And then he computed the region of attraction for each particle, and then these parent particles got the sum of the weights of all the particles from the children within the region of attraction, and so on. And he computed up to very high level. Why is this good? Because when you do a dynamic rendering, then a lot of these cells are actually quite small, so the whole cell is maybe 1 pixel if they are very far from the viewer. So there you don't really need to render. If you wanted to render 100,000 particles in that cell, you would be wasting time because you would be basically just adding weights to the same pixel. So what you can do there is that instead of this, you actually compute what will be the visual size, similar to the idea of how the force calculations are done in n-body, basically. So distant cells you can look at in a very low granularity. And so this works like a charm. And so the claim is that at a given screen resolution, there is essentially no difference in the rendered image compared as if it was done perfectly on all the particles. Okay, and this shows just, for example, a hierarchy of the cells in the Aquarius. And it had also features where you can interactively click on, say, one of the halos or one of the galaxies, and that tags all the particles, and then you can roll the time back, and you can see where all these particles came from in the initial conditions. So basically, with today's technology, if the data is local to the visualization engine, you can do this. And so he claimed that the most difficult challenge was to actually stream the data fast enough of the hard drives that were in that machine in Garching. So he had to play some games with the. Okay, so we have this problem, the data-intensive scalable computing. So we understand data, and data-intensive means we have lots of it, and that's the bottleneck. Scalable means that what we do today, we should be able to continue next year and onwards. So we should be able to keep up with the doubling of the data. And so what are the challenges today? So there is basically the different issues are the storage size. So how do we just keep up with the storage? What is the right system balance between computing and the I/O and storage? What is the data mobility? How do we move the data not just into our systems, but within our systems? So from the hard disk to SSDs to memory, and then through the cache. What are the algorithms, and what is the scalability with respect to power? So when do we blow the fuse, essentially? And what is being done to soften it? And there are different approaches. Again, I think Tomaj mentions it's a scale up or scale out. And generally, so Jim Gray wrote a very powerful paper in '95, way before any of this, where he talked about cyber bricks, where he predicted that as the CPUs are running forward, pretty soon the disk controllers will be on every one of the disk drives will be so powerful that they can actually have these CPU cycles to process all the data that is stored on the disk. Okay, we are getting there. So most of the solid-state disks today have a controller which is an ARM processor, where basically all the software is, so it's not a hardware device, but they have actually an ARM processor which does all the error correction, etc., and the motion of the data within the SSD to recover the errors. But today we already have 8-core ARMs, and soon we will have 8-core ARMs. So if one of them handles the data on the solid-state disks and the management of the data, the other 7 cores, for example, already next year can do a lot of computing. So we have new software platforms emerging. Oh, and by the way, yeah, so the scale up and scale out. So this is basically scale up is when you build supercomputers. So you build really very expensive, 128 processor systems. And in the beginning, Hitachi and so on were building a bunch of those machines, even to handle the data problems. And scale out is what Google and Facebook have done, to buy dirt cheap machines and just sometimes just hang the motherboards essentially off the shelves. They are now packaging it a little better today, but essentially buying very simple machines and a huge number of them. And this also is reflected in the new software platforms that are emerging. So we are seeing basically all the NoSQL and MapReduce Hadoop platforms and so on, where again, they are capable of running on these 100,000 machines, and they can deal with the hardware failures and recover from this gracefully. we need to play with disruptive technologies, and I would call GPUs a disruptive technology because that suddenly the GPUs were built basically for graphics games, and then suddenly they are becoming mainstream in scientific computing, and a large number of the top 10 computers, probably half the top 10 computers in the world are hybrid machines, which have a combination of traditional cores and GPUs. And we also have to realize that a lot of the processing tasks can only be done through algorithms where we basically just stream the data through. So Jim has tried to codify how to approach data analysis problems. And so first of all, he said scientific computing today is increasingly revolving around data and not just about CPUs. And how can you harvest more and more CPU cycles? So data is entering a bigger part of the picture. We need the scale-out solution. And when we cannot move the data, then we have to take the analysis to where the data is. And this is something I would really like you to pay attention to. So we said that, okay, so how does a computer scientist or the person who designs kind of the data analysis environment interact with the so-called domain scientist? Okay, so basically, when I first met him and we talked about Sloan, and he said, give me your 20 queries. What are the 20 questions, the most important 20 questions you want to ask from the data system? And then, okay, I started scratching my head, and I could easily come up with 5 on the spot. And then in another hour, I was able to come up with another 5. And then afterwards, it became really hard. But it was also amazing that once I had to write all those things down, I also had to realize that not every question we want to ask is equally important. And some of them are those that will be run every day, thousands of times. And today we see also millions of times every day. And there are some that we have to be able to do, but it's okay if it takes a day because it's a fairly rare and infrequent pattern. And so when you start a new project, then you should first try to ask yourself, what are my 20 queries? And this is kind of replaces, it's a very humane and mellow way of replacing a formal requirements document. And this, I think, reflects much better how scientists think. And the other, he liked to emphasize that go from working to working. So first build a quick prototype that works. Find out basically how are your 20 questions really the ones that you meant to ask? And then afterwards, kind of keep evolving it. And this is particularly important because the world of computing is changing so fast. So when we started on Sloan, it was still a world when the distributed computing was done in Corba. So I don't think too many people know what even Corba is. Then it was all about, then the grid computing became kind of the bandwagon of the year. Then web services came along, then the grid became grid services, and today everything is cloud. So you go to an airport and you see 3 different cloud providers advertising. And it is, so one thing is guaranteed that in 2 years there will be another thing on the bandwagon. And so we have to, if we always wait, if we design for today or we design for yesterday's technology and take a multi-year development cycle, it's guaranteed that by the time we finish the development, it will be essentially outdated. So if you kind of keep this working to working mentality and keep things in small modular pieces where you can always replace the most outdated components, then I think that's kind of a nice way to stay alive. And a lot of Jim's ideas this is a book that you can download in PDF from Microsoft. So if you just Google the force paradigm, so there are a bunch of essays after Jim was lost at sea. So his friends wrote a bunch of chapters in this book. Okay, so another pioneer is Gene Amdahl. So he's the person who designed most of IBM's mainframes in the 60s. And he had a couple of famous laws. One is the parallelism law that Tomaj mentioned already. But also he had another interesting remark that on the mainframes at the time, he noticed that typically the machine was kind of very nicely balanced, so nothing was waiting. So all the components were equally busy when we had about 1 bit of I/O, sequential I/O, per instruction. So this meant that the typical workload meant that roughly you had about 8 compute cycles per byte of data. So that was a typical workload. And by the way, he also noted that one needed typically 1 byte of memory per 1 instruction. And so it's interesting to see how these numbers have changed over the years. And so at some point, I went and calculated for a bunch of different platforms this AMDAL number. So this is the one you should look at. This is the ratio of the I/O measured per second divided simply by the clock cycle of the machines. So to get an order of magnitude number. And for a typical bare-book cluster today, this AMDAL number is about 0.08 instead of 1 that AMDAL liked. Okay, for a power desktop, which has a bunch of fast, high-speed disks, then this would be about 0.2. For a cloud virtual machine, so people measure this number for the Amazon cloud. They also got something like a bare-book cluster, roughly. Okay, SC1 was what was on the website of Livermore for the Blue Gene in around 2008 when we wrote this paper. So that was 0.001. And SC2 was then the Cray XT3 at Pittsburgh, again at the time in 2008, and that was 0.008. And of course, these numbers could be arbitrary because it depends how many I/O nodes were they basically sticking to the machines. Okay, and this was then a machine that we built out of Dell servers at Hopkins, where we tried to consciously maximize the AMDAL number, okay, from first principles. But how relevant is this? So I talked about this at one of the early XLDB conferences, the extra large databases. And there was a guy there from eBay who is running the eBay databases, Oliver Ratzesberger. And then in the break, he calculated what is the AMDAL number for the eBay servers. It was 0.85. So basically for today, for a data mining workload, for a data warehouse of eBay, basically the AMDAL number close to 1 is actually a very relevant number. And people over the years argued, so especially in the 90s, as the whole cache hierarchy appeared in the processors, people argued that, okay, the AMDAL number is irrelevant because we have cache locality. And so it doesn't matter how we actually read in the data because a lot of the data should be already in cache by the time we process it. It is true for a compute-heavy workload. But when you have multiple petabytes on disks and you want to get them somehow to the processor to have a quick look at the data, actually the AMDAL number is quite relevant again. And if anything, the cache hierarchy gets in the way. So it takes up silicon and takes up power. So anyway, so you can, this is the AMDAL number. So the two purple things are the two supercomputers. The green is a Bear Wolf, and the blue is the Gray Wolf machine that we built in Baltimore. And these are different simulations. So these are the Aquarius and VALE Actia. You can also compute an AMDAL number for a data set. So you can look at the data set, how many terabytes of data, how many bits of data you generated, and how many CPU hours you actually took up to generate that data set, and convert it into instructions, multiplying with the CPU speed. And these are then the Turbulence, which were run on a Bear Wolf cluster. I think the Millennium was run on a similar environment, and so a distributed machine. And then these are the SDSS image processing tasks, and these are then the different size queries of the Sloan database. And so there's an interesting trend. In any case, so basically for the database queries, for the data analytics, we pretty much max out what the hardware can deliver. Here, we are falling a factor of 10 to 100 below what the hardware could deliver, so compared to the green arrow. And here on the supercomputers, we fall a factor of 100 to 1,000 below what the hardware can deliver. And this was not what I expected. I would have expected that we are kind of coming up against the hardware in all those cases. when I sent out this email asking, Volker and Piero and a bunch of other people about these numbers, I also asked about the size of the data sets. And this was remarkable. So when I add up all the aggregate amount of the queries, basically that we delivered, this was, again, between 10 to 100 terabytes. For all these data sets, again, they were between 10 and 100 terabytes, and here it was also between 10 and 100 terabytes. And obvious with these big simulations that everybody would have liked to put out many more time steps, or so basically the limit is not essentially the speed, how we can even write the data, but how we can store, how we can deal with data more than 100 terabytes. And this was, of course, 4 years ago. Today, probably this threshold has moved up. But interestingly, so the conclusion is, what are the three most important things in real estate? Buying real estate: location, location, location. So, and similarly, one can argue what are the three most important things currently for this data-intensive scientific computing is this space, this space, this space. Because we are hitting that wall every step along the way. And of course, the current problems are not on Google, so kind of 10, 30 terabytes is easy. 100 terabytes today is doable because it's okay. It's 33 terabyte hard drives that you can buy of Newegg. And after 300 terabytes, you have to start to build a small cluster. So which means that you have to know what you're doing. And you have to set up the communications and so on. And then also for a detailed analysis, we also not just need a scratch space, we need to park the data typically for several months because it's hard to move the data. So how can I move 100 terabytes in a university? If I use a typical 1 gigabits per second bandwidth, that is sort of typical across the university, it would be about 10 days. If I take over the backbone bandwidth for a day, I could move it in 1 day. But it would not be very popular. But if you take the hard drives and then copy it over to the hard drives, drive the drives across campus, and then plug it in again, that's actually a few hours. So that can be done within a day. So it is not easy. This shows an actual snapshot when we had to move. We were told, okay, so Piero and Michael were running the Silver River at Oak Ridge, and they got scratch space on the Jaguar. It's actually a 10 petabyte file system now, but they said that, okay, you have 2 weeks to evacuate the data. Otherwise, it will be deleted. So we got into panic mode. The 10 gigabit link to Chicago, and then from Chicago, there was a 10 gig link to Oak Ridge. It seemed like a trivial problem. Okay, we copy it over, it should be a day. Well, easier said than done, because all those links had firewalls inserted, also at Oak Ridge. So basically, the head of the Starlight, Joe Mambretti, had to call the head of Oak Ridge cybersecurity to actually allow a pass-through, to open up certain ports on the network so that we could do the at-speed transfers, set up dynamic circuits. We couldn't set up the dynamic circuits from Oak Ridge to Baltimore, so we had to write the data on disk in Chicago and then copy them from there by hand over to Baltimore. So it took several some of the most highly qualified network people in the country to basically turn a light bulb for about 10 days. So it has to be better, but so it's possible, but it is right now, even today, we are at a point when this is not easy. Go ahead. Oh, we use UDT. We use something called UDT, which is multiple streams of UDP packets. And there is a TCP control stream. So UDP has the property that you don't need a handshake for every packet, and the packets are not guaranteed to arrive in sequence. So you have to buffer up on the other end. And if there are missing, you set up a big buffer. And if there are some missing packets, then you request those at the end. But this kind of... Yeah. So every file has a checksum at the beginning, at the end, and also on the blocks. But this kind of maxes out quite nicely. Well, not quite maxed out, but I think we were also in disk limited actually on the Chicago end. So the network probably could have done more, but we could not write the data fast enough. Anyway, so last few slides is about trade-offs. So basically,
Stu Feldman, he's the guy who wrote make originally. That's a piece of code that probably everyone in the world uses several times a day, or at least in our communities. He also wrote Fortran, the first, I think one of the first Fortran compilers when he was at Bell Labs. He is now vice president for Google of engineering. And he gave a terrific talk on extreme computing, where he said extreme computing is about trade-offs. So basically, when Google is designing its own infrastructure, it's making very conscious decisions. What are the features they want to have, and what are the things that they are willing to sacrifice? And by the way, this is a worthwhile thing to think about in terms of your projects. So none of the projects that we do can be everything for everybody. So you have to decide that what is that you really want, or whom you really want to make happy, and which part of your client is the one that you are able to ignore. And so I tried to write down that what would be for scientific computing when we have to deal with these large data sets, what would be my primary criteria? And I would say learning based upon the previous figures, so I would say that the number one is that we need to be able to store a lot of data. So the total storage is really important. This also means that we cannot, for example, afford what Amazon does in its Tivoli system, that they store 6 and 8 copies of redundant data so that no data gets lost, and it still gets lost. But in science, okay, so we can probably store for the most important data sets, we can store 2 copies, maybe 3 copies, basically. Otherwise, the price is too high. Then what's the cost? And one would be tempted to think about the cost in terms of just the raw disk drives, but that's not quite right, because the disk drives have to go into enclosures, then they have to be supported by servers. The servers have to be connected by network. So you need to include the network switches and all that. So, but you want something where the multiplier over the price of the raw disk is not a very large number. And I think we were able to get to about a factor of 2 there. So that then also within the price of the raw disks, there you can buy commodity drives and enterprise drives. The price difference is somewhere between 3 to 7. And the performance difference is very little. And the difference also in the reliability is not very large. You get longer warranties, basically, with the enterprise drives. But this is what every vendor is trying to tell you. So when I was bidding the Datascope out, people were, like, woo, they are trying to scare us. They said, if we put commodity drives into a server, then we lose even the warranty on the server. And that's baloney. So then once we have actually the money to buy the disk drives and we bought the drives, then we actually have to have, so imagine that we have now several petabytes of data sitting on disk. Now we have to be able to read it. And if we can read it only through a random pattern, forget it. So we have to organize the data such that most of our analysis can be sequential read, because the sequential read performance is much better. So generally, the way to do this on the cheap is to buy locally attached disks, because there the cost-bandwidth ratio is much, much better than if you use fiber channels or iSCSI or any of these remote devices. Then once we have the data streaming off the disk, we need to capture it and do some processing on it. And there comes with the GPUs, where really the GPUs are actually a very fast streaming engine. So you can write very efficient data flows where the data kind of goes through the GPUs. And the more you can do inside the GPU, again, so the data is streaming from one place to another and inside the GPU card, the better we are. And the fifth that I would mention is that to do all of this in low power. And of course, using GPUs for a lot of the floating point cycle is already helps with going to lower power, because they are on a different curve on the number of flops per watt than the normal CPUs are. But of course, this is a dynamic game, so this order will be different every year. So what is the cost of a petabyte? This chart is from 2009. And then the raw drives, if you bought a petabyte of raw drives, the commodity, so the dirt cheapest drives, was about $1,000. And then these guys at Backblaze, they are one of the cloud storage vendors. They provided a recipe on the web that you can take to these automatic assembly shops and then they build a chassis for you. And it's the ultimate homebrew machine where you do the vibration damping of the disk drives by taking a rubber band from the kitchen around it and so on. So it doesn't get much cheaper. Okay, and so they were able to build then a petabyte for $117,000. If you bought a similar system from Dell, it would be $826,000. Then there was Sun was selling the Thumper servers, which was the highest density disk package. That would be about $1 million. Okay, then Oracle bought Sun and relabeled the same servers and increased the price by 50%. Then NetApp would be about 1.7. Amazon S3 Cloud would be 2.8 for 3 years. EMC would be also about 2.8 million. And I think the Microsoft Cloud would be 4.5 million to store a petabyte of data for 3 years. So, and of course, these cloud prices are totally artificial. So in a sense, it's based upon the current business model of the companies. They could actually arbitrarily lower this and could make it much more competitive. Yet there's a lesson here somewhere. Of course, the prices have changed. So they went down to, by last summer, they went down to about 50,000 for the raw drives, and I could build a petabyte for about 70. Then the Bangkok floods happened, and the disk drive prices have trebled, and now they are coming down again. So to roughly about, they are now 80% below the cheapest price last summer. So today I could build probably a petabyte for around 90K. So, and this is the data scope that we set out to build. So this, the commodity, yeah. Yeah, or Newegg or Amazon, yeah, yeah. And we have, so we are now tracking, so we bought about 5,000 drives total and for this machine, and we are keeping track, and so far we lost a handful. So over about not quite a year of usage. So it's not too bad. Anyway, so here the idea was to build a machine. It is different, so the purpose is similar to Gordon, but at a much, much smaller scale and much more homebrewed. And here the idea is to use a lot of regular hard drives, mix in some solid state disks that we still have some caching around, but basically build a machine where it's not a computer. I like to say that this is not a computer, but this is an instrument. It's like a microscope or telescope for data. So you can take a big data set, so hundreds of terabytes, you can park it on this machine. You have to write a mini proposal like a telescope proposal. So that I would like to get basically this many machines and this much storage for 3 months or 6 months to my analysis, because moving the data still all in all is so painful that you don't want to do it too often. So once you move the data, it would be nice to keep the data there and then just keep doing the analysis. And it's a two-tier system. There are performance machines and storage machines. And basically, we have 90 performance machines and 6 storage machines. Every one of the storage machines has 720 terabytes of data. And it is RAID 6 and running ZFS. So that's where basically we stage the data and we can check to the data. And the analysis is happening on the performance nodes, which have typically 24 terabytes of regular hard disks. And they also have 420 gigabyte SSDs. But they typically have 0, 1, or 2 Tesla cards directly in the machines. And the I/O bandwidth of the machines is really pretty amazing. So we worked for a year to find the right disk controller, backplanes, motherboard combinations where there are no bottlenecks. The data can kind of stream flawlessly or seamlessly from the disk all the way into the GPU. And everything has a 10 gig card. The storage system has 2 10 gig Ethernet cards. So basically, overall, this is about 6.5 petabytes. And without the GPUs, the cost was about 800K. So which is a pretty good price point. And the sequential I/O speed is 0.5 terabyte a second. And this is actually very respectable because we compare to the Jaguar's file system. Jaguar has a Spider file system, which is about 10 petabytes and has, I think, 240 gigabytes per second. So this is comparable in size to that, and in performance twice as fast for sequential I/O. And probably Gordon is probably faster with all the SSDs. But you know, we are again in a different category. And also we have enough SSDs there that we have a pretty nice IOPS rate as well for random access. Okay. So this is a sign of an overall trend. I'm about to wrap up. So where we see a diversification where one shoe doesn't fit all, even though we have bare-wolf clusters and a lot of more and more standard platforms, but we see an emerging diversity. So floating point calculations are moving to GPUs. Data is kind of moving to some sort of a cloud platform, so using the economy of scale. Random I/O moves to solid-state disks, stream processing emerging, and we are building streaming engines. Even in the software, we see these diversifications. And what remains in the middle? And it's the data. So basically, what we see here that basically data management is becoming common in most of the big science projects. And this is something that everybody needs it, but nobody wants to do it really. And so as a result, nobody invested enough energy that we have a reusable platform that, like the bare-wolf, that you take a recipe and you basically deploy it and it works. And so therefore we are building our own over and over. And this is also becoming untenable. So this is something that you know, if there is a big enough community who are actually at some point starting to share ideas and resources and work, then we will see a bunch of tools emerging for science, and in particular for astrophysics, which solve this problem. And last few slides, so we played some games, for example, using very low power motherboards, the home TV motherboards, and we built a little cluster out of those for under 30K to do pattern recognition and photometric redshifts. And on this cluster, we were able to run in 5 minutes 6.4 billion classical or photometric redshifts, for example, using a random forest algorithm in CUDA. Then Tomaj showed this figure, so where we computed correlation function on GPUs, and this is the baryon bump along the line of sight, and this required computing with all the Monte Carlo 600 trillion galaxy distances, which was done in a couple of days on a GPU machine. And this is one last thing I would like to show. One of the graduate students at Hopkins has been working on the VALE Actia simulation, trying to reproduce what would be the gamma ray annihilation map from the simulation, because there are already papers on AstroPH which claim a detection by Fermi for a gamma ray annihilation from the galactic center. So this is a hot topic. Anyway, so this is the picture computed by Michael Cullen for the original papers published about 2 years ago. And it took about 8 hours for the image. So to take basically every particle, compute the local density, and add up the X-ray flux, assuming a cross-section and emissivity. This was done using OpenGL, not even CUDA, but OpenGL on an Apple, on an iMac, or on a Mac laptop, sorry, a MacBook. And in 50 seconds, the same map. So it turns out that so when you have a ray tracing problem, using CUDA is even roughly 10 times slower than if you can run the same problem in OpenGL, because there the hardware does much of the memory locking that Tomaj talked about. And and it turned out that we could rewrite this in such a way that use the shaders, the so-called particle shaders in OpenGL, basically to do this rendering. And we did a stereographic projection where circles are circles, and then warped it onto a Bolevide projection. But this shows the power of using GPUs the right way. This, you know, from 8 hours to 50 seconds is a respectable speed up. So okay, and then. So what we see all in all, there are these huge sociological changes, not just the convergence of physical and life sciences, but we see that the data collection is getting separated from the data analysis. It's happening in larger collaborations and in virtual observatories, where the analysis is completely decoupled, and we can use databases like the Sloan Archive or the Millennium database to do the analysis. And if you, as an individual, and if you have a great idea, you can just go in and do all the science yourself. You don't need 1,000 people to build the experiment. But we also see the emergence of a citizen/internet science. We also see kind of demographic changes. So for example, there were the Harvard plates that's 150 tons of glass plates taken in the 19th century. And it contains several petabytes of data when digitized. A gentleman who was the inventor of InfiniBand retired, and he got enough money from Harvard to actually build a fantastic scanner machine. But he donated his own time, and he's now digitizing all the plates. Harvard is very keen to get rid of the plates because that's prime real estate. It holds up a whole building next to the Garden Street building. So it was much cheaper to give this guy basically the resources to scan the plates. But we will see more and more of this, that people who retire actually are willing to participate, for example, in the sea science projects. But also we need to start training the next generation, and the traditional scientist is I-shaped. So basically very narrow and deep in one's own field. And the people whom we call today interdisciplinary are T-shaped, so they are still very deep in their own area, but they have a broad but relatively shallow knowledge across multiple fields. But what we need today is pi-shaped people who are equally at home in astronomy and computational science and statistics, so even maybe M-shaped, so they kind of touch the deep level in more than one place. And this is, I think, what was one of the aims of this school altogether, to start this in a systematic way, to basically making people aware that you have to acquire these skills. And you can only acquire these skills early enough, because later on there is just no time. We all are running as fast as we can and doing as many things as we can. So you will never have as much time when you are once you are a faculty member than when you are a graduate student or a postdoc. So summarizing, science is increasingly driven by data. Large data sets are here, but the cheap off-the-shelf solutions are not. We see a changing sociology. We are moving from hypothesis-driven to data-driven science. And the time is right to build the next instruments, the electron microscopes for data, basically. Then we also have the long tail problem, which I really didn't talk about, but it is just as important as then dealing with the big data sets. The same problems or similar problems are present both in business and society, which is all changing. And we see basically this new fourth paradigm of science, which is really a convergence of statistics, computer science, and all of the above. And with this, I would like to kind of close the school. But still, questions are left. Yes. So questions, guys.
I have a question. What are your thoughts about dealing with the law?
So I think the long tail has a much more natural place in sort of a cloudy environment. When you look at Facebook, so you put on Facebook a lot of junk, and which had no relation to one another in the beginning, and when a critical mass has been accumulated, suddenly all sorts of connections and patterns emerge. I think the long tail data is very similar. As long as the data bits are isolated and stored on a zillion web servers, the threshold for accessing those is very high, because even just finding them is very difficult. But if, for example, all the astronomy images were put into cloud storage, and essentially, so we are thinking about giving simply the astronomy community kind of a free storage for images, spectra, and so on, and tables. And then at the same time, then one could start harvesting the FITS headers and create basically a metadata database. And also have multiple replicas this all over the country, so the data is everywhere, and it's always at the right place when you need it. You need it, say, near HiPACC, or you need it near a big simulation you want to compare to that, or you need to compare it to Chandra or to Sloan. There is a copy of the data everywhere. That would be a nice way of doing it.
There is a point of pain if you're going to be paying for storage in the commercial cloud.
Yeah.
And so what would you do about the data that is above that point of pain, but below the level where?
So I would say that build basically a bunch of cheap appliances that we share and spread it out around the community. Maybe put one extra copy of the data into Amazon, for example. So just to get the guarantees, for example, and find the money. But otherwise, I think just get together enough groups, enough universities or supercomputer centers who are interested in participating, and then I think the pain is kind of spread out of maintaining, and use basically OpenStack or some public open source software that requires very little maintenance and development, and use a very simple like a Dropbox lookalike interface on top of it to make it dirt simple for people to upload data. So okay, Manu. Well, there is a serious consideration of building exaflop machines by, when is it, 2030? Something. Yeah, 2018. Holy. Okay. Okay. All right. So basically, there's already a consideration of how to build. So there are all sorts of working groups around which try to figure out how to build a machine that. So today's fastest machine is the Sequoia, which was just commissioned a few weeks ago, and that is 20 petaflops. So that's going to perfect 50 basically in 6 years. That's pretty aggressive, and it has to be also, I think, under what, 20 megawatts or 10 megawatts. Yeah. But kind of on that time scale, I think it's probably going to happen. But also, there will be most likely 1 or 2 machines in the world. So maybe one in China, one in Japan, and that's where most of the push is happening right now. Yeah, Jeffrey. So I think probably all of the above. So kind of scientific problems are a power law. So the computing is also a power law. So I think instead of spending all the money on 2 tiers, so either buying very large supercomputers and kind of buying desktops, then I think one should probably create a couple of intervals in between, so a couple of regional centers. But when it comes to data, there is certainly an economy of scale. And so there are the 2 tensions are basically the economy of scale. The bigger machines you build, the more economical they are to operate. At the same time, the longer it takes to acquire them. So you have to, if you buy 10,000 machines, then you have to put out a big bid, typically for a contract. If you buy 10 machines, you can go and buy it and build it yourself. So you can be more cutting edge. So I think it will be a power law. And the question is, can one convince the funding agencies like the NSF to actually fund also those efforts in the middle? And I think, as I was chatting with Mike, the similar thing happening, in most of the sciences. So there is the big science, and the LHC is getting so expensive the whole world can only afford one. And in astronomy, a 30-meter telescope, God knows how many can the world afford or the US afford, but certainly it's not going to be very many. So most probably the best science comes from somewhere in the middle of like in the Sloan scale projects. And the same will be true in computing, that we have to have the supercomputers, because can only be solved with the very high-end machines. But that's not a good impedance match to then let 10,000 people to use that machine. We have to create kind of lower tier machines which have more capacity and instead of the capability. And have the ability to funnel the data down or drizzle the data down to these capability machines. So, okay. No more questions. I think let's declare the school to have accomplished its goals, I hope. Let's claim victory, guys. And I really enjoyed being here and kind of meeting you. And I hope that this actually maybe created a little perturbation in the direction of that your scientific career will take from now on. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Alex for